Excellent. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about some cryptography basics, a little bit of mathematics, but mostly from a high level, or as they like to say in the computer science world, a large level of abstraction. So we're going to separate ourselves from the mathematics through some examples, discussions, and intuitive understanding versus crunch numbers and stuff. But keep in mind that this is almost the same presentation that I give for my weapons course. So this presentation here is technically worth $150 for each person that is watching right now. So I got Venmo and give you my address if you're kind of like a check person.
We'll buy you dinner when we come to visit.
All right.
That'd be a good dinner. It's $300.
Yeah, it won't be a $300 dinner, but it will be. You'll get us in person too. Right. So
and
we'll
Patrick,
consider our flight and part of our car rental.
And Patrick, you want okay?
No, you cut out. I didn't hear you. I was going to recommend Chez Panisse, which is the best restaurant in Berkeley. So, all right. So going back to something we talked about for the Bitcoin presentation, if y'all remember, hash functions. So in order to kind of get into the meat of cryptography, one thing to understand is what a hash function is. So essentially, it's a basic cryptographic method that takes an arbitrary input, some kind of arbitrary data, and returns a fixed output, or what we call a message digest or a hash value. So any change to the data will change the hash value, and any change might be accidental or might be intentional. So a couple of examples here. So if I give it the word fox and I run it through my hash function, it gives me this message digest or hash out, which is some value of fixed length. If I give it, the red fox jumps over the blue dog, it'll give me a different hash value or a different digest, but of the same length. If I give it Tolstoy's War and Peace, it'll give me a different hash function, but a hash value of the same length as every other hash value. So kind of an interesting property of hash functions there. And it has a few things that make it convenient for us to use for cryptographic purposes. One is it's easy to compute the message of a hash. So it's a pretty readily known process. If you have the algorithm, you have the software on your computer, you can do it. It's not necessarily quick, but it's typically pretty quick in terms of computing time. It is also infeasible to generate a hash message with a given hash. So if I'm looking for a specific output of a hash function, it's nearly impossible to give it some kind of input that will give you the output you're looking for. It's also infeasible to modify a message without changing the hash. So if I have Tolstoy's War and Peace, and I hash that that entire book, and I get my hash value out. If I go back into that book and I delete one period, and then I hash it again, it's going to be a completely different hash value that the function spits out. So any kind of change that you make to the original piece of something will change the hash output, which is a great property for verifying things. So like verifying a download, verifying the integrity of a piece of data, whatever it might be. And then the last property that we care about is that it's infeasible to find two different messages with the same hash. You can technically do this, and it does sometimes happen, but it's even more difficult to find something that has meaning that hash the same value. So if you have two different things where if you hash them together, they give you the same, or if you hash them and they give you the same output, that's called what we call a collision. I'll talk a little bit more about those. I want to skip this for now. We'll come back to this, but we're going to talk about some collisions in hash functions. But first, some common hash functions here. You might have heard some of these or seen them if you kind of clicked on the advanced settings of your internet browser. So MD4 and MD5 or message digest algorithms. Also SHA or secure hash algorithms. 1, 256, 512, 1048. These are all various examples of hash algorithms that are floating around out there and have various usage. So MD5 used to be, I guess, the industry standard for hashes for message digest for the internet and things like that. It's essentially just a sequence of bytes, and then it gives you a fixed 128-bit or 16-byte hash output, which is then written as a string of 32 hexadecimal digits. So people have discovered a way to construct different messages that actually hash to the same value, or otherwise they have found a way to make collisions with MD5. They've actually found a way to make meaningful collisions too, where say that I have say I wire some money to Nathan, and I wire him $100, but then he changes my message so that it says $1,000, and then he changes a few other arbitrary things in the message, and then when we hash my original message and the one that he changed, they go to the same value. So that can be a problem for verification and integrity purposes of data. So MD5 has actually kind of been done away with as far as industry standards. And we now move on to all the SHAs. So why do we care about hash functions? Hash functions allow us to do some pretty cool things in terms of authentication, mostly authentication of passwords, passwords that you use for various services on the internet, your banking service, your email, whatever it might be. So how hash functions are used for checking a password. So when you create a password on a website, the server doesn't actually store that password somewhere. So Gmail doesn't store your actual password.
At least if it's a reputable company, they don't do it.
I was gonna say, at least they shouldn't. They shouldn't store your what we like to call a plain text password. If they're storing a plain text password, that's bad. So if you've ever gone to like reset your password or recover it, and you get like an email that has your actual password in it, that's a red flag, and you should probably consider not doing business with whoever that is, or moving your information elsewhere. It's more secure. So when you go to actually log on to whatever system it might be, you enter your password, and then that password is hashed through one of those cool algorithms we talked about, and then that hash is sent to the server. The server then compares that hash to what's stored on there, and then they have a pretty reasonable assurance that that's the correct password if the two hashes match, because we like to say that the collisions are incredibly rare. So it's not likely that someone's going to enter a different password to get the same hash value. But this keeps those, what we talked about, where they don't have to store your plain text password or your password in the clear. Couple of things about this, which we'll get into, of ways that people have found a way to beat this system, and they've also found ways to make it more powerful. So here's like a typical model of what it might look like. So you start, take your password, run it through a hash like MD5, and then store that hash on the database. And then if we want to check the password, we start out, we take your user password, we run it through a hash algorithm, and we compare that output to the output we had stored on the server that we were running, and then we verify that they're the same, and then we start whatever session that we're trying to run. We let you open your inbox, let you log onto your bank account, whatever it might be. Go ahead, Nathan.
The reason why it's bad, Pat, stop me if you're going to talk about this. The reason why it's bad if a company just stores the plain text and they don't store hashes is that, if you can go back just one slide, Pat. If that database at the bottom is hacked, if they have the plain text passwords, they can access everybody's account immediately, whoever hacks the database. Whereas if it's a database of hashes, that at the very least buys you some time, because they'll need to basically iterate through passwords to find passwords that match the hashes, because the hashes by themselves aren't usable to actually access any data.
Yeah, and actually storing, which we'll get into a little deeper here, storing just the hash value, that's also considered like garbage to your security. And we'll poke at why that is here. So just like Nathan was saying, people can perform what's called a rainbow attack in order to get access to your system. This leverages more the fact that people are bad at making passwords. where, if you have password 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, your username, football. So there's databases out there that you can just download huge databases of like top 100 most common passwords, top 1,000 most common passwords. This means like in reality, there really aren't that many passwords out there. Like we only have so much variability between each person. So a lot of things are going to overlap, especially since, we're not all like super creative and can just think of all these crazy passwords and remember them. So therefore it's easy to kind of find the original message. If we just start trying random passwords at whatever server we're trying to get into. And they call it a rainbow attack because you just enter, every possible input under the rainbow. And this can even be enhanced by using what's called a dictionary attack. So you take not only your top 100 most common passwords, then you also take just a dictionary of the English language and various words and compound words, and you just throw it at the problem. And you just keep trying over and over and over again until you find one that matches. So this is bad. And one of the reasons why, in addition to just storing the hash value, so the problem here is, say that they are stored as hash values, but my password is password. The word password is always going to hash to the same value. So if I hack that database and I steal a bunch of hashes from that point, if I compute a bunch of hashes of commonly known passwords, I can just see what matches and determine, oh, this person's password is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because the hash values are the same. So that's why we add something on top of this called salt. Sprinkle a little salt, and this will help make your password scheme more secure. So it's kind of a solution to the rainbow attack table. Random sequence of bits is added with the hash function when we enter the password. So we take your password, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we also append some information on the end of that. It's randomly chosen when the account is created. So when you create a new account, you create a new password, it doesn't just take, your password 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It takes your password 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then appends like several hundred just digits of random data on the end of it. That way it gives your short password a little bit more security. That way, if an attacker gets a hold of that hash table, not only do they have to know the password, but they also have to know all of the salt that was added to that password, and just requires more computational strength, a lot longer time to break into the account if that's something that you're trying to do. So if you have a sufficiently large salt, or you add enough information to the end, then it kind of makes this whole process infeasible. The salt has to be known by both parties, so that's why it's something that's established initially. And if you try to verify your password without knowing the salt, it won't work. It will fail. So this is kind of a process that happens in the back ends. I don't know the salt to any password that I have. It's all a scheme that's developed, per server, and there's standardized ways to do it. There's also variable ways to do it. But in general, a general technique for developing a salt is to append the time that you created the account and the password at the end of the password. So say you're opening a new bank account, you go log on to make your new account, you make your password 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it'll append the time and the date to the end of that and store that as your password plus salt and then hashed.
So is the way that basically works is if you try to log on to your bank or whatever, you type in your password, it sends your password, it appends the salt to it, then it passes it through the hash, and then it compares that to the database.
Yes.
So the database is hacked, then there would be a hash that doesn't match your password directly. It'd be something plus your password would be the hash. So there wouldn't be any way to convert it. So in practice, a hacker would basically need to hack both the salt database and would need to know your password in order to get those two things together.
Yeah, he would need to know where the salt came from and how it was created, which typically it's just the time. So they have to know like exactly when the exact date and time that your account was created, which is hard, or maybe it's in the logs, you don't know. So it just doesn't make it impossible, but it adds an additional layer of security to the scheme of storing hashes for passwords. So kind of just a visual example there. So we take our password plus the salt value, run it through our hash algorithm, and then we get some kind of hashed output, which is of fixed length. Yeah, so depending on how much data you have, we'll make it more secure. So if you use a 10-byte salt, you get, a ton of entries, a ton of different possible entries there for the rainbow table. And therefore, if you wanted to try to iteratively guess every single one of those, you would be looking at terabytes and terabytes of data in order to sift through. So not exactly practical. But one of the easiest ways that you can make a password more secure is really just by increasing the length. So if you have a number of passwords of length n, you have a number of passwords of length n, and you have a number of possible characters k, then k to the n is the number of possible combinations that you could run there. So if you have 26 digits, if you use just the alphabet, lowercase letters only, then you have 26 to the n. If you use lowercase and uppercase, 52 to the n. Lowercase, uppercase digits, 62 to the n. So the actual more important factor here, and the one that you can control, is n, or the length of your password. So therefore, adding a salt to a password effectively increases n. But you can also do this on your own. And the way that you can do this is actually a little bit counterintuitive and actually contrary to most of the guidance and most of the requirements you get in terms of passwords. So the strategy is effectively to just make a super long password. If you've ever, tried to log into a government system, or lots of banks do this too, where you must have one uppercase letter, must have one lowercase letter, must have two characters, must have, one special character, X, Y, or Z must be 8 to 12 characters in length. That's all great and good and everything like that, but it doesn't really make your password more secure. It just makes it harder to remember. Where the best kind of password that you can design is one that's just as long as possible, but that doesn't just that isn't a proper sentence, and that isn't all common English words. But so the idea being, if you can just word associate a couple of words, 4 or 5 of them, and then have like maybe one strange word in there that isn't English, or maybe it's from like a book or something like that, that will massively increase your security for your passwords. But the thing is, a lot of the systems that you try to log into probably won't let you go over a certain number of characters, and also require all these weird kind of modifications that you have to make. But really, the most secure is just really as long as possible.
So if you go back, it says that it's 2 to the power of 44 for guessing. Isn't it really just the number of letters in the dictionary to the power of 4 guessing if you do a dictionary attack?
Yep.
I think the saying is 2 to the power of 44 is a little misleading.
Yeah, and this one is also not like a super great one, because these are all common words, right? So, correct horse, battery, staple. Like, yeah, those are great, but it's nice because it's long, but it would be better to have some kind of weird word. So like you can maybe pick a city in Michigan that people have never heard of and put it in there. But that's like the point being, if you make it super long and easy to remember, it's just a stronger password. It's also, easier for you. Always striking a balance here. Like the perfect password is, 100 characters that are all like this, but no one's going to remember that. But we'll get into some techniques actually here. So a couple of ways to mitigate attacks. Sometimes you might run into this if you keep typing in your password wrong, or you have caps locks on, so they just throttle you. They don't actually allow you to do so many more than a couple of attempts per second or per minute or whatever it might be. So most systems now have some kind of throttling thing. You can't just blast passwords at a system over and over again until you get it right. That affects you if you're trying to log into some kind of active online system, but offline attacks are also possible. where people, they get that database of hashes, and they get that database from the company or whatever that they stole it from, and then they basically just run like a brute force attack, password attack on that database, trying to figure out what those passwords are. And it might be a dictionary attack, it might be a rainbow attack, it might just be they start at A and go A and then just iterate from there over and over again. So that's one technique that they could use. There's also toolkits out there that are free and widely available that allow people to crack passwords. John the Ripper there, hacking toolkits on Kali Linux, which is a operating system you can install that comes pre-loaded with a bunch of cool stuff that allow you to crack passwords. So all these things make it easier to kind of run these various attacks. So one thing that you can do to protect yourself is to use two-factor authentication. So maybe it's something like a login and a password, and then something you have, whether it's a code that's sent to your cell phone, maybe it's a fingerprint, maybe you have to use some kind of certificate that you have for your job, and like an ID or something like that. Like for the Navy, we have our cool military IDs loaded with a bunch of certificates that allow us to authenticate. Or some other kind of one-time token. So just using two pieces to make it more difficult for someone to log in. So that way it's less likely that the account will be compromised. There's also cool things out there like password managers that allow you to greatly increase the complexity of your passwords without having to remember them. So this prevents you from having to reuse passwords. But at the same time, these are effectively a honeypot of passwords where if someone gets your master password for this, now they have access to everything. So various ways to protect yourself from that, but a trade-off in security one way or the other. I like to use what I call the tiered approach. So this is trademarked, not peer-reviewed, not verified anywhere else, but this is kind of a schema that I've come up with that's been pretty successful. So tier 1 is all of your important stuff, banks, email, highly personal information, things that if you had cross-connectivity between the different systems, that would be bad. So if someone could access my email, my bank account at the same time, that would be really bad, because then they could authorize transactions and do whatever they wanted. So these have all unique, all complex, and all two-factor authenticated password schemes. Then I have what I call tier 2. So this is, maybe mostly all the same passwords, some kind of variation on a common theme. And this is anything that's linked to a payment service. So anything that touches either a credit card or anything else, or has the potential to touch those, I would lump that in my tier 2 type of passwords. And then tier 3 is just like, I don't really care. So tier 3 would be like, there's nothing personal on there. There's no payment info. If someone steals my password from one thing and is able to log into the other thing, don't really care. So if I had like a Tumblr account and a Twitter account, inconsequential if someone's able to access those. Just delete the account. It doesn't matter. Cool. So shifting gears a little bit out of the password hash algorithm world into encryption. Great comic there. The best form of decryption is really just a $5 wrench. But we'll first start with symmetric encryption after we do a basis of what cryptography is. So cryptography in general is a mathematical pursuit, the practice and study of hiding information, providing a secure means of storage of information, a secure means of verification, and a secure means of discussion, exchange of information. It supports 4 of the pillars of what's it called? Cybersecurity here. So confidentiality, integrity, authentication, and non-repudiation. Confidentiality means I don't allow anyone else to get the information. that I don't want to. Integrity means no one can get into my information and change it unless I allow them. Authentication means only people who are authorized to see it can see it. And non-repudiation is if someone makes a change, they can't deny that they made a change. So anyone that makes a change to data, it's clearly shown through whatever mechanism it's used to secure it. So the main ways that we hide information are encryption, so scrambling a message so that only the intended recipient can see it, also known as a cipher, through hashing by using an irreversible algorithm to obscure the information, and through steganography, which is Greek for concealed writing, to keep the message's existence unknown. So encryption and cryptography have been around for a very long time. One of the earliest examples, not the earliest, but pretty early on, was the Caesar cipher, also known as a shift cipher. So in this one, essentially you're just given a number, and that number is the distance in which you shift the alphabet in order to encrypt the message. So in this case right here, we have a Caesar cipher number of 3. So an A becomes an X, B becomes a Y, C becomes a Z, D becomes an A, B becomes a B, F becomes a C. And then that just goes all the way around the wheel right here. So this is a great way for quick encryption and decryption. So it looks something like this. We have a plain text, a quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, and a ciphertext, which would spit out something like this. So this was about all that was necessary in Caesar's era. First of all, most people couldn't read, so it doesn't really matter if you hand your message to like a messenger. What you were really worried about is that message falling into the hands of an adversary who could read. So you need some basic protection in order to make sure that only the intended recipient knew how to decipher it. But even in those days, this method of encryption was cracked, and now it is trivially cracked. You can generate a Caesar cipher and then just literally paste that into Google, and it'll tell you like, oh, this is a Caesar cipher. Here's what it actually says. So it's pretty easy to do these days. But there's been various schemes of cryptography that have been built off of this concept, which we won't be covering today, but kind of interesting and ways to kind of make this secure, which have been mixed success. So overall, the idea of encryption is that we have some kind of process for transforming information to make it unreadable to anyone, not just our intended recipient. So we want it to make it completely unreadable unless we apply some kind of special knowledge, also known as a key, to make it readable again. So this provides confidentiality. And in order to kind of get into the meat of it here, we have to understand a couple things, a couple definitions. So the plain text is a word that we've already used before, but that's just the original message. Plain text is the unaltered message in whatever format it exists in. It could be data, it could be an email, it could be a text file, it could be whatever. The cipher is the actual algorithm that we're going to apply to it. The key is a piece of information which allows us to control the cipher's output, and the ciphertext is the transformed information that you get by combining the plain text and a key text and a key in the cipher. So algorithms are usually related by the key, both for encryption and decryption. That means you take your plain text, you use your key in your cipher, gives you your ciphertext, and then if you use that cipher and your key again, it'll give you your plain text out again. So that's what we call reversible. And typically, you have to have the key known to both parties if they want to communicate via this scheme right here. So the key typically represents a shared piece of knowledge in between two parties. I'm going to skip this one because I have a better one. So I come up here. But overall, cryptanalysis is the study of methods for obtaining that encrypted information without the knowledge of the key. So as soon as someone tried to hide information, someone else wanted to get their hands on it. And so there's been, various efforts throughout history. This picture down here is from the Imitation Game. which is kind of a dramatization of Alan Turing and his work on the Bomba and various ciphering machines, which broke the Enigma code back in World War II. So the whole idea is you want to target some kind of weakness in cryptography. You want to exploit some kind of mathematical principle that will allow you to get your hands on that plain text. And this could be done through a couple ways, whether it's through analysis of the math. You might also get little pieces of information that allow you to do that analysis through, traditional spy means, bribery, coercion, burglary, social engineering, things like that. So a couple of different ways that we can perform cryptanalysis, a couple of different things we can do. The most common one is frequency analysis. So this works really well against those Caesar ciphers, where essentially we just look at our text that we're given, and if we see repetition in a few letters, we can just use our knowledge of English or whatever language it might be in order to determine, what that letter might represent. So this makes deciphering that Caesar cipher pretty trivial. Even if you have some kind of more complex method where it's not just a straight shift of letters, if you have any kind of one-to-one mapping of the alphabet to a different alphabet, frequency analysis is pretty much going to bust that one. Makes it pretty trivial. And like I said before, even if it's not an exact Caesar cipher, if it's some kind of frequency-based mapping algorithm, then you can just Google that and it'll tell you like, oh, this is actually what the message says.
Yeah, that's why the Germans in World War II, they at least had some rules in place that like limited message length, because the longer a message is, the easier it is to do these types of analyses. Whereas a shorter message, it's a lot harder to do these types of analyses, because you think about like, if you have a message that's like 3 words long, how can you do frequency analysis on it? It could be, anything. Whereas if you feed like a whole book, frequency analysis is really easy to do.
Yeah, not only that, but they also had very complex schema, one of which was the Enigma machine, in order to prevent frequency type analysis from being used, where you had changes in the types of mappings that you would have even within the text itself. So very, very complicated, which we won't get into here. But one of the coolest ones is what's called a chosen plain text attack. So knowing 2 of the pieces of our encryption equation is enough to get the third. So if we have a plain text plus a key, we can generate a ciphertext. If we have a ciphertext plus a key, we can generate the plain text. So then if we just have 2 of those pieces, we can get the third one just by analysis there. So a couple of ways that you can get the piece that you're looking for, and typically like a social engineering type thing, but here is one example of those. So a chosen plain text attack. So what if we could make the adversary send a message of our choosing, or at least some text that the attacker knows. So if we combine the ciphertext with known plain text, we can reveal the key and then use that key for future decryption of the rest of the messages. So this was actually used during the Battle of Midway in World War II, and still used today for a few analyses. So in 1942, Admiral Yamamoto assembled his carrier task force with a diversionary raid off the Aleutian Islands to lure the US Navy into a battle that was, in his hopes to destroy the rest of the fleet there. From a decrypted message, the US commanders knew the general outlines of the plan and even the timetable. However, they did not know where the Japanese actually intended to strike because they weren't able to decrypt that part of the message. They just knew it was AF. So in order to determine what AF stood for, they created a ruse, which would allow naval intelligence to confirm what they already suspected, in that it was Midway. So they arranged for US forces at Midway to send a clear, so unencrypted radio message saying they were running short on water. They then monitored the Japanese message traffic and saw that AF was running short on water. This allowed them to confirm that AF was Midway and that the attack was planned for midway. And of course, as we know, the rest is history from there. So one pretty cool, decisive example of a plain text attack in our history. All right, so we've kind of gone over the big picture of encryption, symmetric encryption. What I want to get into now is a little bit of asymmetric encryption. So this will be, first we'll break down symmetric a little bit more, and then we'll jump into what asymmetric encryption is, otherwise known as a public key, private key system. So these concepts we're pretty familiar with. We talked about plain text, we talked about encryption, and a ciphertext. And what we're trying to accomplish is confidentiality and integrity. We don't want anyone to read our messages, and we don't want anyone to make unauthorized changes. All right, hold on, there's someone at my door.
We can talk while he's gone. How much did I miss?
Nathan? Nathan, can you hear me? What is the name of the person aboard the submarine that handles your code?
I'm not going to talk about anything related to this in submarines.
Well, I mean, what's the rank, or all I wanted, I mean, what is the name, or what is, I mean, you're would it be the code breaker, or, you know, or?
I'm not going to talk about anything related to this in submarines.
Nate can either confirm or deny any of the information presented here. Anyway, okay, so our symmetric encryption. We have, me over here, and we have Nate over here on the right. So in order to perform symmetric encryption, we establish some kind of key between us, some kind of shared piece of knowledge that we both have. That way we can exchange information securely. So say I want to send a message to Nate. I take my plain text here, and I take my key. My message is submarines are great. I encrypt that plain text, and from there I get a ciphertext. So this is unreadable by me, it's unreadable by Nate, it's unreadable by anyone that gets a hold of it. From there, I send that ciphertext over to Nate. He takes that same key, he decrypts the ciphertext, gets the plain text, he can read it. Great, submarines are great. The problem here is that if anyone else has that same key, they can also decrypt that text at any time. So they could, decrypt my message. They could change the message, re-encrypt it, and then send it to Nate. Something that's called a man-in-the-middle attack. So this is a problem because if we have this shared key, we have to have some way to share it. We might not always be able to meet in person and exchange, like a piece of paper with a huge key written on it. So we have to figure out some way that we can exchange keys without someone in the middle taking it or stealing it from us. So that's where we get asymmetric encryption. So asymmetric encryption uses a public key and private key pair and helps us to accomplish the same goals of confidentiality and integrity. So we start by key creation. We start by making our key. We essentially take two very large prime numbers and we run them through an algorithm to create a public key, and we run them through an algorithm to create a private key. The cool thing about these prime numbers is that they are very easy to multiply together. However, once we get that product, it is very hard to divide them back out and determine what those two numbers were that we multiplied together. It's a principle of prime numbers that Nate talked about in his previous presentation. So kind of a cool thing there. There are various schemes that will allow you to do this. However, they are very inefficient, and they make your computer run very slowly as you attempt to find those two prime numbers that you multiply together. So once again, we use that algorithm, create our public key, which we can use to lock or unlock data. And we create a private key, which we can also use to lock or unlock data. And that's because the public key is the mathematical opposite of the private key, and the opposite. So they are mathematically inverse. One undoes the other. So I actually booted up my computer and ran a program called PGP, which is, I think, pretty good privacy is what it stands for, if I remember. But you can generate these things and you can run it yourself. But most of this is done on the back end through the various pieces of software that you use on your computer. So here is my prime numbers. So you can actually make the software spit it out for you. So here they are. I have my first very large prime number, and then my second very large prime number here represented in hexadecimal, I suppose. I'm not really sure the notation with the colons in between there, but some various form of hex. From there, after I run those two bad boys through my algorithm here, I get my private key. So this is my RSA private key. Write this down. No, just kidding. It won't do you much good as it no longer exists on my computer. I can generate as many of these as I want to, but this is my private key that I generated from those two big prime numbers. And then I can use this private key to make as many public keys as I want and encrypt things and decrypt things. So let's get back into the algorithm here. So here we go. I've got my private key. I've got my public key. My private key is only known to me. My public key, I give it to everyone, and I let them know it. So I can take my private key, encrypt a piece of data or a plain text, get my ciphertext, and then use my public key to decrypt that ciphertext, get my plain text back out. So say I have a piece of data and I encrypt it with my public key. I get my ciphertext out of that. I can then decrypt it with my private key. So they are mathematically inverse, as we talked about before. Encrypting with one is undone by encrypting with the other. So all you have to do is fire one at the other, and it will do or undo the process. So something to keep in mind as we see how this works in a practical application. All right, so now we have Nate and I again. I have a private key and I have a public key. Nate has a completely separate public key and private key pair. So our private keys and our public keys are related within ourselves, but they are unrelated to each other. So these are a pair, mine are a pair, his are a pair, but they have no relation to each other back and forth here. So from here, I can take my plain text and I can try to send it to Nate using some kind of encryption method here. So if I take his public key and I encrypt the plain text and get my ciphertext out, he can then take his private key and he can decrypt that ciphertext and get the plain text back out. So this is pretty great because now we're able to exchange some information securely, right? But can anyone see a problem with this scenario here?
I mean, it is, I guess one potential problem could be it assumes that we have some sort of way we can kind of communicate in the open about the fact that we're even using cryptography at all. I mean, someone could intercept the fact, because some countries, for example, encrypted communication is illegal. So somebody could see that I'm sending you a key, and that would be a crime right there.
Definitely that. I did not consider the geopolitical angle of the scheme here. But the one that comes to mind for me is that Nate's public key can be accessed by anyone. So anyone could take a message and they could encrypt it, and then they could send it to Nate. They could say, Nate, I hate submarines, love Pat, and then encrypt it and then send it to him. And then he would think that's from me. And of course, I would never say that. So we have confidentiality, right? So like once something is encrypted with Nate's public key, only Nate can read it, but we don't have integrity. Anyone can send him anything, and there's no way to verify, who that's from. They're just sending him a bunch of encrypted data, which only he can read, but kind of pointless if we can't verify who it's from, or we can't verify, what it is. So let's try it a different way. So I take my same plain text here, and this time I encrypt it with my private key. Get my ciphertext out. Nate then takes my public key and he decrypts the ciphertext, and then he gets the plain text out. So same kind of thing here. Everyone has my public key. This is public knowledge. So anyone could take that public key. They could decrypt my message and they could read it. But I guess the good thing here is because I encrypted it with my private key, that verifies that it's from me. So in this scenario, we have integrity in that you can verify that message is from me and it has not been tampered with, but we've lost confidentiality in that anyone can decrypt the message, anyone can read it. So.
But he
attempt
can't
free.
change it.
What?
But they can't change it.
They can't change it, no, but they can read it. They can't change it because I encrypted it with my private key. I guess they could change it once they decrypt it, but then they wouldn't be able to encrypt it again with my private key. So it'd be obvious that it came from someone else. So any guesses on the solution to this issue?
Combine them.
Yep. And that's what we'll do. So what we'll do is we'll first encrypt with my private key. So I take my message, I encrypt it with my private key. I will then encrypt it with Nate's public key. And now I have a ciphertext. So I have a ciphertext that's been encrypted twice. Nate's then going to take that ciphertext and he's going to decrypt it with his private key. So it undoes the first encryption that we ran on it. And then he's going to decrypt it with my public key. And that undoes the second encryption. And then boom, we have the plain text out. And there's not anything a man in the middle or some kind of potential, nefarious doer here can do about it. Because we have achieved confidentiality in that Nate is the only one that can read this message. And we have achieved integrity in that he can verify that this message was signed by me. So this is actually the scheme that most connections, secure connections, use now. When you go through when you establish like a TCP transfer control protocol connection to start exchanging data. And what this is used for is not necessarily to exchange every single piece of data back and forth, but to exchange a key that we can use for symmetric encryption. The reason being is, as we can tell from this, we got to do two processes. So this is computationally expensive to use this for every single piece of data that we might want to send. So what we'll do instead is use this asymmetric encryption scheme to share that secret piece of data, to share that key, and then we'll use a faster encryption scheme in order to do the rest of our communications. So this allows us to accomplish a key sharing without a prior common secret between us. And that is all I have. Now I'll take any questions.
I figured out what the colons are in the hexadecimal.
What?
It's like commas in a different numbering system. It's just so that if you're typing it yourself, it's easy to look at it and type it.
Yeah, that because of each one's a piece. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, because it divides two numbers. Everyone is two numbers. So it just makes it so that if it was just like a big block of numbers, it'd be really difficult to copy by hand. Go back a couple of slides.
Okay.
The prime factorization slide. Yay. Maybe this one. Yeah, it was that one. The whole prime number thing, there are, if you all have heard about quantum computers, before, that's kind of where the concern for quantum computers comes from. It's a different type of computer architecture. And in general, it is about as good as normal computers. But for some very specific questions, it can solve problems much, much, much faster than normal computers. And one of those problems is factoring prime numbers, potentially. There's an algorithm that exists that could be implemented on quantum computers to basically trivialize factoring prime numbers. So there are a lot of people working right now to make encryption schema that are considered like post-quantum computer schema, so that quantum computers won't completely destroy encryption standards.
Shor's algorithm.
Yeah, that's the algorithm. But that's one of the very specific problems that quantum computers are very good at, potentially.
Pat, do you know anything about the Enigma machine?
I do.
How
So
did
I read, go ahead.
how did the I know the British captured a sub, correct? Or the sub, the Germans the Germans were going to sink the sub, but the British got aboard and stole the Enigma machine. I don't understand how somehow the Germans didn't get word that the Enigma machine was stolen, even though the sub had not sink. The sub did not sink until after they got the Enigma machine. I mean, what a stroke of luck.
There's a couple of things like that, and I can't remember the exact order, but so the original Enigma machine was designed by the Polish, and I can't remember its name. It's something in Polish. So they were the original designers. The Germans improved upon it. The Polish had a couple of them, and then the Germans also, they had that one that was taken on the sub. So they had their hands on like probably 3 or 4 of them throughout the entire time that they were working on the problem. And the Germans actually updated their technology a few times in the midst of the problem as well. But the way that they actually solved that, the way that the Bomba machine, which is the thing that solved the Enigma, is essentially a chosen plaintext attack. Is they would take a message, they would spit it through the Enigma machine that they had, and then they would take that output and spit it into the Bomba machine, and it would try to determine the key by basically a mechanical version of brute force. They would brute force attack it in a mechanical way, but via an electrical powered machine. So it was pretty cool. And so I read Alan Turing's like biography, and I had to read that chapter like 3 times to figure out like how it actually worked, because the Enigma machine is pretty smart. And they actually, for the longest time, once they started cracking messages, they didn't take any action on it because they wanted to, preserve that ability to know what the Germans were going to do for a critical time. So most of the things that they cracked, they just like reported and like, okay, like don't do anything about this, because if they know essentially that we've cracked the codes, then they'll change the codes again, and that'll make our lives miserable. And the Germans were so sure in the Enigma machine that they thought that they, had like defectors and spies that were giving away information versus the Enigma machine being cracked.
Yeah, because even if you possess copies of the Enigma machine, that by itself is not enough to give you the solutions to the ciphertext, basically. Just having the machine doesn't mean, that's not, like knowing the internal schematics can help you in your process of cracking it, but it by itself doesn't cause you to crack it.
Well, didn't it take about 2 years before they, it was an amount of time that they figured it out?
It took a long time. It was a pretty in-depth process. And it wasn't just like Alan. If you watch the movie, The Imitation Game, which I recommend, it's a pretty good movie. It made it seem like he was like this dude who solved it all by himself. It was like hundreds of people working on it, and it was a non-trivial task. Like he definitely did a lot, but it wasn't just him. There was so many people committed to that effort. And then after the war was over, they destroyed everything. They're like, we're never going to talk about this again because we don't want like anyone to know that we were able to do this. Essentially, the guys at GHQ or whatever it is in England.
And there are people now who they have computer programs that they write themselves in order to crack the Enigma machine. And I think a lot of people, the way that they do it is, it turns out, I think go back another slide or two to the thing about, yes, these just distributions. It turns out that I think Pat was talking about how like the Enigma machine had different schema. They had different rotors you could put in different positions. And that was part of what made it so they could keep changing the cipher. But it turns out mathematically, if you get, even though there were like 5 or 6 rotors, if you get just one of the rotors correctly, this type of analysis is going to yield you a very slight improvement over just a randomly picked combination. So what you can do is you can basically just increment through the rotors, and you find what's the correct position for the first rotor. Okay, we got that. Now we're going to increment through the second rotor, because it will be very, very small and subtle changes, but something that a modern digital computer can interpret pretty readily. So it's really like a lot of it was just there were problems on a fundamental theoretical level on the type of ciphertext that they were doing. And I think the Germans, or at least with Enigma 2, if you put an A into the machine, it was not possible for it to put an A out, which is another vulnerability in their ciphertext.
I'm going to pull up a picture of the actual machine here from one of my previous.
I was just looking at it.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And there's like, these are all what he was talking about. These are all rotors, like every single little square here. If they close the machine, you can see it on the front, but they're all rotors that are essentially abstracting different positions that those Enigma machine rotors can be in, in parallel that way. And I think that so I don't remember how many rotors are in it. There's several rotors in there, and there was one that like never changed. And so like that, once they found that out, that like made it super easy. They could decrypt something in like 30 minutes for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to, Pat, is that it was like you could set it so that every time the first rotor turned, that like you could set some sort of proportion, like every 5th time the first rotor turned, it would cause the second rotor to turn. And then they also implemented in that the second rotor, once it went a certain number of times around, it would cause a third rotor to turn. But a message would need to be incredibly long for the first rotor to turn enough to cause the second rotor to turn enough to cause the third rotor to turn enough. So it turned out that implementation of third rotor turning didn't really even do anything. But Pat, didn't you say that you encrypt all of your day-to-day communications using an Enigma machine at your place?
I do. I have a mechanical Enigma machine. And then I mail the keys, or mail the rotor positions, and then send the text via email or whatever. And then I encrypt that with PGP. That way, it has to be encrypted. I always like.
Go ahead. Sorry.
For the Navy, I always like the discussion about, we can't use XYZ service because it's not encrypted. And it's like, okay, well, great. Like it's all encrypted per the Navy standards by something called TLS, which is Transport Layer Security. So basically the entire internet is encrypted up to the Navy's PII standards and things like that, which are very low. But we still throw a big fuss about it. Like, oh, it's not encrypted emails. Okay, well, it's actually all encrypted. And the only people that don't have encrypted email are in the Navy. So it's a mess.
Now, wasn't the actual Enigma machine that was captured about the size of a typewriter?
That's exactly how big it is. And it has like 3 rotors in it.
And it was made out of wood, right?
It is, the outside.
Yeah.
It's electrical. So there's electrical components in it. And essentially when you press one key, it'll light up with a different key of what it maps to.
Basically, It was in a wood case, right?
Yeah, it looked like that.
I don't think you can see it.
It's blurry, but
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
Sorry about
it's like in
that.
a suitcase.
Yeah.
I'll stop the recording here.